He turned slowly toward the deepest corridor, flashlight trembling in his hands, and whispered to himself, "If I keep going, I might uncover something the valley was never meant to find." Before we start, join our YouTube family by subscribing to the channel. Don't forget to like this video and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. Now, let's get into the story. At 18, he owned almost nothing. A faded backpack, a rolled-up blanket, a pocket knife his father once carried, and a stubborn belief that somewhere in the world there had to be a place meant for him. The valley he grew up in had never felt like that place. It was beautiful from a distance. Green fields, quiet farms, and a wide river that curved through the land like a silver ribbon. But beauty didn't always mean opportunity. The farms had been struggling for years. Wells dried earlier every summer. Crops failed more often than they succeeded. One by one, families packed their trucks and left. The town slowly grew quieter. Stores closed. Windows were boarded. Even the old train station that once brought life into the valley had become a silent building covered in dust. By the time he turned 18, he realized something important. If he stayed, he would disappear along with everything else. So he started looking for anything that could change his path, any strange job, any forgotten property, any opportunity other people ignored. That's how he found the listing. It wasn't online. It wasn't in a newspaper. It was a crooked piece of paper pinned to a wooden board outside the town's general store. Most people passed it without reading. The ink had faded and rain had wrinkled the paper. But one sentence caught his eye. "Forgotten mountain tunnel for sale. $12. He read it 3 times. At first he thought it was a joke. Who sells a tunnel? And why would it cost less than a used shovel? But curiosity pulled him closer. The paper explained almost nothing. Just a rough map pointing toward the northern mountains and a name written at the bottom. The legal owner who had inherited the land years ago but never bothered to visit. Apparently, the tunnel used to belong to an old mining company that vanished decades earlier. When the company collapsed, the land passed through several owners who didn't care about it. Now someone simply wanted to get rid of it. $12. Most people laughed when he asked about it. "You mean that cursed hole in the mountain?" one farmer said. "Miners sealed it for a reason," another warned. Someone else claimed strange echoes came from inside at night. But the more people laughed, the more interested he became, because sometimes the things everyone ignores turn out to be the most important. 2 days later, he spent almost all the money he had and signed a simple piece of paper at the town office. Just like that, the forgotten mountain tunnel became his. The clerk barely looked up while stamping the document. "Good luck with that," she muttered. He left the building holding the paper like it was treasure. For the first time in his life, he owned something. It might have been useless. It might have been dangerous, but it was his. The mountains rose behind the valley like giant stone walls, gray cliffs stacked against the sky, with pine trees clinging to their sides. A narrow dirt path twisted upward toward the location marked on the map. The climb took almost 3 hours. By the time he reached the area, the valley below looked small and quiet, like a painting left in the distance. The tunnel entrance was exactly where the map said it would be. Half buried, thick weeds covered the rocks. Rusted rails stuck out of the dirt like old bones. A metal frame marked the tunnel mouth, but the wooden support beams were cracked with age. Someone had tried to block the entrance years ago using stones and debris. Wind blew softly through the trees, carrying the cold smell of damp earth. For a moment, he simply stood there staring. This was it, his property. A hole in the side of a mountain. He laughed quietly. "Well," he said to himself, "I've definitely owned worse." Then he started clearing rocks. It took hours. Sweat soaked his shirt. Dust filled the air. Several times he considered giving up and coming back another day. But stubbornness pushed him forward. Piece by piece, the blocked entrance opened wider. Finally, there was enough space to squeeze through. Cold air rushed out from inside the tunnel the moment the last stone fell away. It felt strange, not like normal mountain air. It was colder, deeper, like the breath of something sleeping underground. He turned on the small flashlight he carried in his bag. The beam cut into the darkness. The tunnel stretched forward farther than he expected. Old mining rails disappeared into shadows, and thick wooden beams held the rock ceiling in place. Water dripped slowly from above. Each drop echoed. Drip, drip, drip. He stepped inside. Dust rose under his boots. The air smelled like stone and rust. Every sound he made bounced along the tunnel. Walson came back to him seconds later. At first, he walked slowly, unsure of how stable the ceiling was after all these years, but the deeper he went, the more he noticed something surprising. The tunnel didn't look collapsed. In fact, it looked strangely intact. Old mining tunnels usually caved in after decades without maintenance, but this one seemed preserved. After 15 minutes of walking, the entrance light behind him had completely vanished. He was surrounded by darkness, except for the small circle of his flashlight. The rails continued forward. So did the wooden supports. The tunnel floor was mostly clear, as if someone had once taken care of it. That was odd. Mining companies rarely maintained tunnels they abandoned. Another 10 minutes passed. The tunnel suddenly widened. His flashlight beam swept across the stone wall, and then it stopped. Something smooth reflected the light back at him. He stepped closer. His heart began to beat faster, because it wasn't rock. Embedded in the wall of the tunnel was a massive steel door, not rusted, not broken, just covered in dust. The edges were sealed tightly into the stone, like it had been built there deliberately. ... It looked far, newer than the rest of the tunnel. He wiped dirt away with his sleeve. Cold metal gleamed beneath. Right in the center of the door was a small engraved symbol. A droplet of water? He frowned. This wasn't mining equipment, and miners didn't build sealed steel doors deep inside tunnels. He stepped closer, studying the hinges, the handle, the strange locking mechanism beside it. That's when he noticed something even stranger. Next to the door was a metal control box partially buried under dirt. A single lever stuck out from its side. The metal looked old, but intact. He hesitated. Pulling random levers inside abandoned tunnels usually isn't a great idea. But curiosity had always been stronger than caution in his life. He reached forward slowly, his fingers wrapped around the cold metal handle. For a moment, he considered walking away. Then he pulled the lever down. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then the mountain began to shake, and somewhere deep inside the tunnel, ancient machinery suddenly woke up. Because the forgotten tunnel he had just bought wasn't a mine at all, and the door he had opened was hiding something the entire valley had unknowingly depended on for generations. The rumble didn't stop. At first it was soft, like distant thunder trapped inside the mountain. The ground beneath his boots vibrated slightly, sending small pebbles rolling across the tunnel floor. Dust drifted down from the wooden beams overhead. He froze beside the lever. For a second he thought he had made a terrible mistake. Old tunnels weren't supposed to shake. He quickly stepped back from the steel door, shining his flashlight around the tunnel walls. The supports were still holding, but the deep mechanical sound kept growing louder. Echoing through the stone like something enormous was waking up after a long sleep. Then the steel door moved. Slowly, with a deep metallic groan, it slid sideways into the rock. A rush of cold air burst out from the opening, so powerful it made his jacket flap. The air smelled different from the tunnel, cleaner, colder, almost like water. He lifted the flashlight and aimed it inside. What the beam revealed made him take 2 stunned steps forward. It wasn't another mine. The space behind the door opened into a massive underground chamber, carved directly into the mountain. The ceiling arched high overhead, supported by thick concrete pillars instead of wooden beams. Rows of enormous metal pipes stretched across the cavern in every direction. Some were as wide as tree trunks. Others curved upward toward the ceiling before disappearing into the rock walls. Huge cylindrical tanks stood in long lines along the edges of the chamber. Everything was coated in decades of dust, but nothing was broken. The machinery looked old, yet strangely preserved. He stepped inside slowly, his boots echoing against the concrete floor. The tunnel behind him felt tiny compared to the size of this place. His flashlight beam swept across gauges, valves, pressure meters, and thick control panels mounted along the walls. It looked like an underground facility, a big one. But why would something like this exist inside a forgotten mountain tunnel? He walked deeper into the chamber, trying to understand what he was seeing. Pipes ran across the floor like metal rivers. Some disappeared through openings drilled deeper into the mountain. Then his light landed on something painted onto a large, concrete platform in the center of the cavern. The letters were faded, but still readable beneath the dust. He wiped the surface with his sleeve. Valley Water Reserve Emergency System. He stared at the words, the valley, his valley. For years, the farms below had struggled with droughts. The river ran thinner every summer. Wells dried up earlier each season. People always said the valley simply didn't have enough water anymore. But now he was standing in a hidden chamber filled with pipes and tanks, designed to move enormous amounts of water. The realization slowly formed in his mind. This place wasn't a mine. It was part of a forgotten water system. He walked along one of the giant pipes toward the far side of the chamber. His boots echoed loudly now that the machinery around him had started to vibrate. The rumbling sound was growing stronger. Somewhere behind the walls, motors were turning. Deep within the system, something had begun moving. His flashlight found a massive iron wheel attached to one of the pipes. It looked like the kind of valve used to control water flow in large industrial systems. Rust covered the edges. The wheel hadn't been touched in decades. He placed his hands on it carefully. The metal was cold and rough under his palms. If this truly was a water system, turning the valve might start something. Or it might break something that had survived quietly for 50 years. He hesitated. But curiosity had already carried him too far to stop now. He tightened his grip and pushed. The wheel didn't move. He tried again, using more strength. Still nothing. The rust had practically welded it into place. He stepped back and examined the mechanism more closely. The base of the valve was covered in dust, but the pipe itself looked solid. Thick bolts held everything together. If the system had been built well enough to survive this long, maybe it could handle being turned again? He braced one foot against the pipe and pushed with all his strength. For a moment, nothing happened. Then suddenly, crack! The rust snapped loose. The wheel jerked forward and began to turn slowly beneath his hands. He stumbled slightly as it moved. A deep roar exploded through the pipes. Water. Real water. Somewhere inside the mountain, a powerful surge rushed into the system. The pipes trembled violently as pressure began building. He jumped back as several gauges on the wall flickered to life. Needles that had been frozen at zero for decades began climbing upward. The chamber filled with the echoing sound of rushing water moving through tunnels, carved deep inside the mountain. It was like hearing a river running underground. He spun his flashlight around the cavern in amazement. The machines weren't dead. They had just been waiting. High above the chamber, thick pipes led upward toward the surface. Others disappeared into smaller tunnels, branching out in different directions. It suddenly became clear what this place had been built for. Long ago, engineers must have created a massive emergency water reserve hidden beneath the mountains, a system designed to store and distribute water during severe droughts. But over the decades, people must have forgotten it existed. Records were lost. Owners changed. The tunnel entrance became buried, and eventually the entire system faded from memory, until today. The pipes vibrated harder as more water rushed through them. A low alarm bell somewhere in the chamber rang weakly, its sound echoing across the cavern. Lights mounted along the walls flickered faintly. They didn't fully turn on, but a few small bulbs glowed dimly for the first time in half a century. He stood in the center of the chamber, stunned. Just hours earlier, he had been a teenager with a backpack and $12. Now he was standing inside the heart of a forgotten water system, capable of feeding the entire valley below. But something else caught his attention. At the far end of the chamber, beyond the rows of tanks, another passageway opened into darkness. This one was different from the mining tunnel he had entered. The walls were smooth, concrete. Pipes ran along the ceiling, and beside the entrance stood another steel door, much larger than the first one. Unlike the first door, this one was still tightly sealed. Above it, barely visible beneath dust and faded paint, were two words: Control Section. His flashlight lingered on the door. If the chamber he had discovered was only a reserve tank system, then the real control center of the entire underground network might be hidden behind that door. He slowly walked toward it, the sound of rushing water echoing around him. The closer he got, the more details appeared. Thick, locking bolts, warning labels, old electrical panels mounted beside the frame. This door had clearly been designed to stay closed, which raised an unsettling question. If the valley had forgotten this system existed, then who sealed the control room, and why? His fingers brushed the dust from the door handle. For a long moment, he simply stared at it. Then he noticed something carved into the metal beneath the faded paint. Not a warning, not a company logo. A message scratched there by someone long ago. 3 words that made his heart beat faster. "Do not open," and for the first time since entering the mountain, he wondered if discovering the tunnel had been a mistake. The chamber continued to roar with the sound of rushing water. The giant pipes vibrated as pressure moved through them, carrying thousands of gallons deeper into the hidden system beneath the mountain. Old gauges clicked and trembled on the walls, their needles slowly rising, like they were remembering their purpose after decades of silence. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the large steel door that read Control Section. The scratched warning beneath it, "Do not open," kept pulling at his thoughts. Someone had left that message. Not a machine, not a company, a person, which meant someone had been here after the system was built, and they had wanted the door to stay closed. He slowly stepped back, running his hand through his dusty hair. The responsible thing to do would be to leave the door alone. He had already discovered something unbelievable, a hidden water reserve system powerful enough to feed the entire valley. That alone could change thousands of lives. But curiosity had shaped every important decision in his life so far, and curiosity was now standing in front of a sealed steel door. He turned his flashlight toward the nearby control panel mounted beside it. The panel was covered in thick dust, but the buttons and switches were surprisingly intact. Several old indicator lights were dimly glowing now that power had begun flowing through the system again. A single metal handle sat near the bottom. Another lever. He exhaled slowly. "All right," he muttered quietly to himself. "If this collapses the mountain, I'm going to feel really stupid." He grabbed the handle. For a second, nothing moved. Then he pulled. The mechanism inside the door clanked loudly. Thick locking bolts retracted from the frame with heavy metallic thuds. For a moment, the door stayed still. Then slowly, it opened. Cold air rolled out from the darkness beyond. His flashlight beam cut through the dust. The space behind the door wasn't another chamber, like the reserve room. It was a long corridor. Concrete walls stretched forward with metal cables. Running neatly along the ceiling, old control consoles lined the sides, covered in buttons and switches that hadn't been touched in decades. This place looked different, more organized, more important. He stepped inside carefully. The corridor echoed with each step. The lights here flickered faintly as electricity crawled through ancient wires. As he walked deeper, he began to notice framed diagrams hanging on the walls, large engineering blueprints. He wiped one clean with his sleeve and held the flashlight closer. His eyes widened. The drawing showed the entire valley, but beneath it was something incredible. A massive underground network of tunnels and reservoirs spread through the mountains like veins beneath the earth. The chamber he had discovered was only labeled Reserve Tank 1. There were 6 more reservoirs hidden deeper in the mountains. Pumping stations, filtration systems, emergency flood controls. Whoever built this had created an enormous underground water management system designed to protect the valley from both droughts and floods. It was brilliant engineering. But somehow the entire system had been forgotten. He kept walking. The corridor eventually opened into a circular control room, filled with old computer panels and mechanical control boards. Large windows of thick glass overlooked another cavern below. He stepped closer to the glass. What he saw made his jaw drop. Below the control room stretched a colossal underground reservoir filled with dark, still water. The pool was enormous, like an underground lake carved inside the mountain. Water slowly poured into it from several pipes high above, creating soft ripples across the surface. The valley's hidden water supply, decades of stored reserves waiting quietly beneath the earth. He leaned both hands against the glass. All this time, the valley had been suffering droughts, while millions of gallons of water sat hidden beneath their feet. But then something else caught his attention. On the far side of the control room sat a wooden desk covered in papers, not engineering papers, personal ones. He walked over and opened the top drawer. Inside were old notebooks, dusty journals. He opened the first one carefully. The handwriting inside was neat, but hurried. Year 1, the system is complete. If the valley ever faces severe drought, this reserve will save it. But the council doesn't understand what we've built. He flipped to another page. Year 5, maintenance funding has stopped. The town believes the system is unnecessary. They think the river will always provide. Another page. Year 11, if this facility is abandoned, I will seal the control section. If the wrong people discover it, they might drain the entire reserve for profit. His heart pounded. The final entry was written shakily. Whoever finds this one day, protect the water. The valley will need it more than they realize. He slowly closed the journal. The scratched warning on the door suddenly made sense. Someone hadn't sealed the system to hide it. They sealed it to protect it. He walked back toward the glass window overlooking the giant underground reservoir. The sound of water flowing through the pipes had grown stronger now, because the valve he turned earlier had restarted the entire system, which meant something important was happening far above. Miles away, down in the valley, old irrigation pipes were beginning to tremble. Dry wells that hadn't produced water in years suddenly began to gurgle. Farmers standing in their dusty fields heard the strange sound first. Then the water came. Clear streams burst from long-forgotten pipes. Irrigation channels filled again. Fountains in the town square suddenly sprayed water into the air. For the first time in decades, children ran laughing through the streets. Farmers stared at their fields in disbelief. The valley was coming back to life, and none of them yet knew the reason. Back inside the mountain, the young man stood quietly in the control room. He wasn't homeless anymore. He wasn't invisible anymore. Somehow, by chasing a strange $12 listing that nobody else cared about, he had discovered the forgotten heart of the entire valley. But the journals had also revealed something else. This system was much bigger than the single reservoir beneath him. 6 more reserves. Miles of tunnels, hidden infrastructure buried across the mountains. He looked down at the map again. Several sections were marked sealed, untouched, unexplored, which meant the tunnel he bought wasn't just an abandoned entrance. It was the key to an entire underground world the valley had forgotten, and somewhere deep inside that network, there might be secrets no one had ever discovered.